every episode of this podcast thus far, it has been pretty solely focused on CMMC. But I also want to cover broader federal frameworks, including the dreaded F word, FedRAMP. So today I sat down with Tony Bai. He's the Chief Solutions Officer at RiskPoint. Tony and I go back. We know each other from his time previously at A-LIGN, where he initially taught me everything I know about these federal frameworks. He is, as you'll find out in this conversation, a wealth of knowledge. And in this particular episode, I decided to focus on sort of the nuance and intricacy of FedRAMP as it pertains to working with DoD agencies if you're a cloud service provider. So we end up covering a broad range of topics, including the DoD provisional authorization process, FedRAMP ATOs. We couldn't not get into CMMC a little bit and talk about controlled and classified information, and more. So without further ado, please enjoy this conversation with Tony Bai on this episode of Mostly Compliant. All right, Tony, thank you again so much for joining me here today. This is a nice reuniting of this. For those that don't know, Tony taught me basically everything I know about the federal compliance space when he was over at A-LIGN years ago. So, Tony, it's great to be chatting with you again. Thank you so much for joining me here.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, and we can rehash all the things that we talked about before as well. So,
yeah, you just keep reteaching them to me. Yeah. Well, there's a couple topics that I want to dive into here. A lot of the podcasts that I've done thus far on this have touched on CMMC, very focused around CMMC, but obviously still have a ton of conversations around FedRAMP and how that might intermingle with CMMC and the DoD program. So I'm going to try to tie some of those sort of threads together. So, Tony, if you don't mind, I'd love to first tee it up with, could you give us an overview? There's a lot of confusion around, people know FedRAMP, they hear the FedRAMP term, but when you work with the DoD as a cloud service provider with the cloud service offering, they have a slightly different process, this provisional authorization process. And I've heard something about impact levels. Let's start with just an overview on what is the DoD provisional authorization process and how does that differ or sort of intermingle with the FedRAMP program itself?
Sure. Oh, sure. Start with an easy
Just
question.
An easy layup. Just explain it all.
Just explain the entire program. Okay. So the easiest way to understand what the DoD does around FedRAMP is think of it, and they've even referred to it as FedRAMP Plus. What it is the DoD has leveraged the FedRAMP program and process and framework and added their own specific needs on top of it. So that's kind of where you hear about the impact levels, whether it's 2, 4, or 6. There is no 1, there is no 3. It's 2, 4, or 6. So with that, this has developed what they call a security requirements guide. It is the Cloud Computing Security Requirements Guide, and when you download that off of the DoD Cyber Exchange, you unzip that zip file. It actually gives you 2 separate security requirements guides, and that's a recent change too. One is specific around the cloud service provider, which explains this program from the cloud service provider perspective. The other one they call the mission owner security requirements guide, and that is from the perspective of the DoD agency that's leveraging that cloud service offering that needs to get that DoD provisional authorization at the IL2, 4, 5 level. So that's what that is. That's where all of this derives from. At the end of the day, it does leverage either the FedRAMP moderate or the FedRAMP high baseline that you get from FedRAMP, but then there's DoD overlays on top of that and review processes. And that's explained in those SRGs. At a high level, DISA or DoD has stated that IL2 is equivalent to FedRAMP moderate. So at that point, your mission owner acts as that initial agency sponsoring the FedRAMP program, and you go through the normal FedRAMP process. There are additional things that a cloud service offering has to do, called generally referred to as DoD general readiness requirements that really revolve around how you implement and connect to the DoD NIPRNet, the non-classified internet protocol network, NIPRNet. So that's kind of where a lot of those DoD GRRs or general readiness requirements revolve around. And that can be done at the mission owner level. That's your initial agency partner, equivalent term, or sponsor that people talk about on the FedRAMP side. IL4 and IL5, IL6 is where it gets more complicated. At that point, the DoD authorization process looks more like, for those that are familiar with the old JAB process. If you kind of think about this, DISA's cloud assessment team, that provisional authorization, think of that as similar to the provisional ATO that the JAB used to issue, and then the agencies would issue an ATO based on that. That's the same thing where DISA acts as the JAB, and then the mission owner acts as the agency sponsor or initial agency partner. That's how that works. Now, the differences of the baselines or the overlays is that IL4 is meant to protect CUI. That's the intention of it. It adds about just roughly around 30, maybe 40 controls on top of the FedRAMP moderate control baseline or the FedRAMP high baseline. IL5, there's a recent change in July of this year, is a FedRAMP high baseline, as well as an additional 170 on 180 controls. And that is
around, added a bunch more, right?
Yeah. So there used to be two pathways on IL5. One was called a non-NSS or non-national security system, which was like an additional 30 or 40 controls on top of the FedRAMP high baseline. And then the national security system baseline or overlay added the 180 some controls. They eliminated the non-NSS. So that's the big change that happened in July. So anyone that currently has an IL5 PA from DISA, I believe this is telling them that they have until their next annual assessment to show validation of those additional controls for the NSS to maintain an IL5. Otherwise, I believe they're going to be downgraded to an IL4.
Oh, interesting. So kind of similar how they FedRAMP transitioned from Rev 4 to Rev 5. They're like, hey, you have a certain amount of time to show us that you're covering this delta.
Yeah. So that's how I've been told it. Obviously, with shutdown, it's hard to get a hold of DISA or anyone for authoritative, but that's from what I understand of talking with others that are involved in the process and everything. That's what's happening.
Okay.
So that's what that is. And IL5 is for what they call national security systems, or if the mission owner states that there is criticality or sensitivity system that requires that additional control scope that they want to add, even though it doesn't necessarily meet the definition of a national security system. And then IL6 is for those that are pursuing classified work at the confidential or secret level. So that is a complete separate. There's, you have to have cleared folks, cleared personnel, everything else. But that is few and far between. I think there is maybe 10 or 12 IL6 PA that have been issued since the beginning. And if those are things, then obviously you'll have to talk to the appropriate people because there are additional things around that. On top of the actual controls, there's additional things that DoD requires, like U.S. persons only is part of it. Obviously, it needs to reside in because of U.S. persons only, you can't just use like AWS GovCloud or Azure commercial or things like that. So it does place additional restrictions on top of the actual controls as well. And those are all listed in those security requirements guides. Yeah, and some of those U.S. persons only, that gets added at your like the IL4 and above level, right? Right. IL2 is typically going to be a contract requirement if they require it at all. Right. Okay. And so for anybody listening, because I get this question a lot, even on the FedRAMP side, where your baselines are low, moderate, and high, there's LISAS as well. But now we're talking about impact levels. To your point, it's really like FedRAMP plus these additional controls to get these to these impact levels. If somebody's listening to this right now and they're like maybe having to go through this process or thinking about going through this process, but they're in the early stages and they don't know what potential impact level they would be denoted as, could you first highlight who is the ultimate decision maker on that? And then early on, maybe before they have that conversation with the decision maker, how would you guide them about going about strategizing around which one they should start to aim for? Oh, that's kind of a loaded question. The ultimate decision maker is always going to be the agency, right? Yep. The mission owner in coordination, especially IL4, IL5, in coordination with DISA, because DISA is the executive agency that issues the PA itself, right? So the same thing as with a normal FedRAMP, you need to do your normal categorization process. So under FedRAMP, they talk about FIPS 199, FIPS 200. You look at the NIST 800, was it 60, volume 1 and 2, the data types, and then you look at that and you aggregate with a high watermark. All this process explained in 199, 200, and everything else. Mm-hmm. It is the same process you do for FedRAMP Plus, except instead of FIPS 200, there's a documentation called CNSSI 1253, which is essentially the DoD's version of FIPS 200. Got it. Which does the same thing. Look at your data types, look at the recommended security requirements of those data types, you aggregate those and do a high watermark to determine what the appropriate impact level is. When it comes to now that'll get you your impact level for DoD systems. IL4, IL5, it's more of like looking at what that data is. Is it going to be considered CUI? Then you're probably going to want to do IL4. right?
Yeah,
If
yeah,
it's a sensitive type of operation or data, again, that's talking to your potential clients on the DoD side and understanding what they are partial to, because that's likely what you're going to need to be. Or
yeah.
there is a specific requirement of what is a national security system. It is like an acquisition defined definition of what that is. If you meet those that definition, I think it's like 5 or 6 criteria. I can't remember offhand, but if you do meet those, then IL5 is probably going to be pretty
Got
mission
it. Okay.
as well.
But to your point, ultimately it's the mission owner. So like have that conversation as much as you
Yes.
can, right? Because they're going to
Yep.
be the one to deem it. Because oftentimes I'll have clients come and even if it's on the FedRAMP side, they're like, yeah, we're starting to go down FedRAMP low. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Like, is your agency said that they're cool with low? And they're like, oh, no, we just think it'll be low. And I'm like, I would confirm that before you start going too far down that path, right?
Yeah. I mean, there are some agencies that kind of have a standing policy where, hey, FedRAMP low, but we won't authorize anything below a FedRAMP moderate. So then the CSP is forced, if they want to do business with that agency, to implement all the FedRAMP moderate controls and get that FedRAMP moderate authorization as well. So that does happen. I've seen it happen every now and again.
Okay, so Tony, if you don't mind, talk me through, there's also confusion around, okay, if I'm doing work with the DoD, I have a cloud service offering, I want to store, transmit, and process that federal data, metadata, whatever it is, if it's CUI, IL2, IL4, whatever. Okay, I'm getting this provisional authorization. How does that relate to Fed? Does that mean I'm FedRAMP authorized? Can I do them both at the same time? Talk us through that.
So, like I said, with IL2, you're going to work directly with your mission owner and follow the normal FedRAMP pathway, right? So the mission owner will issue an ATO, and then that will go through review for PMO, and you go on the FedRAMP marketplaces authorized at the FedRAMP moderate level for impact level 2. You'll also be listed as IL2 on the DISA maintains its own approved product list as well around that. For IL4 and IL5, it is different. So per those security requirements guides that I talked about, it does specifically state that only DISA can act as the agency when submitting for equivalent status in the federal marketplace. So when DISA issues the provisional, the PA, the provisional authorization, that's similar to the old JAB PATO. So the mission owner would issue an ATO based upon that PA from DISA, right? They would do their own internal review of the package, or they've actually participated as part of that review of the package. But once the PA, then they can issue an ATO. The PA acts as the ATO with DISA as the initial agency partner, and they submit a request to FedRAMP PMO. And then from based on that, FedRAMP PMO will review for completeness of the package and put you on an equivalent FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP high authorization on the FedRAMP marketplace. So DISA acts as your agency partner around that. That's how that works. So the ATOs from the mission owners is internal to the DoD. Everything external to the DoD is relying upon that PA from DISA at the IL4 and IL5 level.
So DISA can then basically communicate with and go through for FedRAMP to get you listed on FedRAMP marketplace from there.
Pretty much what I believe. It's a template form for request, and then they send a copy of the package, and PMO reviews that for completeness. And then when the CSP does their monthly comm, they report to DISA as well as to and upload it well copy to FedRAMP PMO.
Okay, let's talk about the inverse. Let's say I'm FedRAMP moderate authorized. I'm working with civilian agencies. That's cool. Maybe even some DoD agencies at IL2. A new DoD agency comes and says you need IL4 or IL5. What does that process look like?
So at that point, there's some decisions that the CSP has to make. Are they going to do a split up like a DoD only offering that also meets the IL4, IL5 requirements, or create some sort of tenants that has a higher level around IL4, IL5 if that's architecturally possible and sound with their existing FedRAMP authorization, right? So depending on that pathway depends on what has to happen. Ideally, if you're leveraging the existing FedRAMP authorization, then you still have to do that review process with DISA for the IL4, IL5 aspect, but it should only be a gap assessment of the additional controls since the other controls have already been authorized under the existing FedRAMP authorization. And that's outlined within that security requirements guide as well.
Okay, very good. Sounds like the guides cover a lot of this. Read the boring documents. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. Sometimes it's a matter of just finding out where it is in there in that document. But yeah, it is pretty thorough around what the entire process looks like.
Okay, cool. All right. So let's talk about one thing that becomes a hairy topic with a lot of clients that want to go through the DoD provisional authorization process, especially above IL2, and maybe you can break that part down. This need for a readiness assessment as part of their initial intake review process. Talk
Yes.
us through that, because a lot of clients are like, what? I have to do a whole separate audit if I'm doing this versus
Yes.
FedRAMP?
So that is required per the process established by DISA. So there is a readiness. Now, it is not the same as a FedRAMP ready assessment for FedRAMP ready status on the marketplace. What the FedRAMP readiness assessment for DoD does, or the FedRAMP Plus or DoD readiness assessment, is really exactly that. Review a list of subset of controls to ensure that you are prepared to go through the full assessment. It is a gate check.
Yeah.
It can be leveraged for FedRAMP ready status because it does rely on a majority of the same control statements, but by default, it is strictly internal to DoD. So a lot of confusion, like I'm sure you've heard too, is like, if I go through this and I'll get FedRAMP ready, right? Well, not necessarily. You can request and work that out with the DoD and with your 3PO, but it is not a default thing to do. You have to work through and get agreement on that. It is strictly meant to ensure that the client or the CSP is ready for that full assessment.
Yeah.
Now, when you kind of mentioned if you're already FedRAMP authorized, that can take the place of the FedRAMP or the DoD readiness assessment, but only if you have an existing FedRAMP readiness and at the discretion of DISA. So DISA can always say, like, oh, you already have FedRAMP authorization, but we still want you to do the DoD wrong. I believe they are slow change because it does specifically state there is like the FedRAMP or the DoD readiness or something equivalent, right? And the equivalency is the existing FedRAMP authorization package.
Got it. Okay. You said the equivalency word. Maybe this is a good, you know where we're going. Maybe this is a good time to detour into this area. So we've talked a lot about the provisional authorization process. So if you're a cloud service offering and you're wanting to work directly with a DoD agency, okay, you mentioned IL4 is generally involved with CUI, control to classified information. A lot of people listening probably know CMMC. That has to deal with CUI along with FCI and some other data, but primarily, level 2 certification, the meeting of NIST under 171 controls has to do with your handling of CUI itself. So IL4 has to deal with that, but I thought there was this thing about FedRAMP and FedRAMP equivalency also. So I think it depends a little bit, right, on whether you are directly working with that DoD agency or if you're working within the supply chain. Can you kind of clear the air there a little bit? Like,
okay,
hey, CUI is IL4, but CUI is CMMC. What is it?
Well, hopefully we don't get any saying that, some comments later on saying you're absolutely wrong, you've misinterpreted. But this is, from what I understand and discussing with everyone in the field and my experience at the DoD and everything else, is this. IL4 is for those for an authorization, meaning that system is going to be used in direct support of the DoD, right? FedRAMP model equivalency applies to CMMC and 80171, where that is designed and implemented for systems that are not in direct support of the DoD. They are non-federal IT systems, right? And the most simplistic way I can say that is if a system has an ATO from a federal agency of any sort, that makes it a federal IT system, because that means a federal agency has done a risk determination to authorize its use and the information it provides to operate on behalf of the government. That makes it a federal IT system. A non-federal IT system is something that's ancillary to whatever that direct support you're providing on a contract is for those vendors. So and the reason why I'm splitting those hairs is because, what we talk about modern equivalency is outlined in the DFAR 7012 clause, right? When CUI is used by a cloud service, it must be FedRAMP authorized or FedRAMP moderate equivalent. And that's the difference between the two. That FedRAMP moderate equivalency only requires at the moderate level because it's not in direct support of the DoD. Whether that's true cybersecurity or not, or proper implementation, that's beside the point. This is what has been outlined, the process and review and approval process.
Okay, that's helpful, I think, because I get into those conversations a lot where, hey, I'm being told I need CMMC, but I'm a cloud service offering, but I'm working with the DoD, so is it IL4, is it FedRAMP, is it FedRAMP equivalency, is it CMMC? There's a lot of confusion out there. So I think while we're on this, a lot of confusion that you and I both deal with on a day-to-day basis with CMMC and FedRAMP equivalency is, hey, I'm being told I need CMMC level 2 by my client. Okay, cool. What do you do? Well, we have a software as a service, and we're a cloud service offering, and the CUI only flows within there. Okay, great. CMMC level 2 is not what you need. you need FedRAMP moderate authorization or equivalency. So let's start there. Could you explain why that is the case? You just touched on it a little bit. It's initially in DFAR 7012 and then some CMMC language later, but touch on why and where this initial sort of need for FedRAMP came into place with CMMC and CUI in the supply chain.
Where it started, I can only go by what has always been existing within the DFARS requirements, right? So
yeah,
it
that's
says
what I
that
meant.
you're using cloud service offering that you needed to meet FedRAMP moderate authorized or FedRAMP moderate equivalency, right? That's just where it generates. Now, in the beginning, there was a lot of confusion, or at least a lot of vagueness around what FedRAMP moderate equivalency meant. And then DoD came out with their memo from, was it now 2 or 3 years ago now?
I think almost 2 years, December. Yeah, this infamous memo.
That specifically states what FedRAMP moderate equivalency means in the eyes of the DoD. And that's really what started generating this. And then when 32 CFR came out that codified officially the CMC framework, it did define that the FedRAMP moderate equivalency requirement only goes into effect if the cloud service offering processes, stores, or transmits CUI itself, right? If it's just strictly security protection data, then it falls under the CMC's level 2 certification, whether it's a cloud service or not.
Yep.
So it really is, if you are a cloud service offering being leveraged and you handle CUI, if it's in direct support of the DIB, that's where the FedRAMP moderate equivalency or getting a FedRAMP moderate authorization falls. To get the FedRAMP moderate authorization, though, you need to be leveraged and used by a DoD agency or a federal agency of some sort that is directly using your service for you to have them as your initial agency partner and get the official FedRAMP moderate authorization and be listed on the FedRAMP marketplace.
Yep. Which is not a simple thing to do. A lot of organizations would kill to get an agency to sponsor them. They have all the time and money in the world potentially, but that is the big hurdle. So that's very tough. But there's another option, or equivalency. You mentioned that the memo outlined and finally defined, because everybody was like, what does equivalency mean? The DoD said, hey, here's a memo defining from our perspective what equivalency is. Could you outline what they put in that memo and what do you need to do to get deemed FedRAMP moderate equivalent?
Oh, you're putting me on the spot here. Let me see if I can't bring up the memo.
No, you're good. I don't expect a full list, but the general approach being you need a 3PAO assessment against those moderate controls and all that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So the general thing for the FedRAMP moderate equivalency is essentially implementing a full FedRAMP program of your cloud service offering, right? And then also having it validated by a FedRAMP 3PAO. And the added addition of the fact that you must be 100% compliant essentially at the time of assessment for that. And that's the very difficult part of the equivalency aspect of it.
Yep. So the no POAMs thing is, it's a little bit, I don't know. It's odd because people go, okay, so FedRAMP authorization can be very hard to get because I need a federal agency sponsor. Okay, well, this equivalency, that must be an easier option then that they've offered. Not so fast, not really. While you don't have the agency sponsorship requirement, it is in some ways a little bit harder because you can have no findings at the time of the assessment. Whereas with an authorization, you can carry like low, moderate findings, right?
So remember, the FedRAMP authorization itself is part of, it's a cloud specific version of the risk management framework. It's a risk management decision that needs to be made. So the agencies, the federal government can make that risk decision to accept certain findings and track them on the phone to make sure they are at least being addressed and everything else for use by the government. Because moderate equivalency doesn't have some sort of central government authority to accept risk, that's why you have to have that 100%. Because there's no one that says, there's no one outside the government that can say, oh, we accept this risk. That finding is good enough for use by the U.S. government. There's no entity that can do that. That's why that 100% is there.
That's true. Don't you think?
Intellectually, I understand that. I don't necessarily agree with it, but I do understand it.
I was going to say, don't you think, and now we're just getting it into the territory of us rewriting the equivalency memo potentially, but don't you think there's a world where they could set their own standard of X number of low findings, Y moderate, no high or critical, anything like that?
You could, but you still run on the government side who's going to establish that standard on behalf of the entire U.S., on behalf of the DoD.
Yeah.
I'm not sure DoD has the appetite to set that, and then who's going to enforce it and maintain it and moderate that, and manage it, right? that's the thing. That's why the DoD has engaged with the cyber AD for them to handle the day-to-day aspects of it. Can it be done? Yes. It's going to get ugly. It's going to get very messy on authorities and spheres and roles, and getting approved what that approval is going to look like in guidance. So, not saying it can't happen, but it's possible.
Yeah. So what about this? And for anybody listening, this is total conjecture. This is just Tony and I spitballing on, we know that FedRAMP moderate authorization or equivalency is a very high bar. What, if any, lower bar could they do? I think there were just some discussions at least, or pitches from 3PAOs and things around, what about just a ready status? You get FedRAMP ready or have a readiness assessment done against just those core controls. What are your thoughts on that? Similar issues to what you just outlined?
It is, because FedRAMP moderate equivalency is outlined, you have to meet the entire FedRAMP baseline. So some sort of
I'm talking about rewriting potentially the equivalency. Like in your eyes, do you think that would be a feasible sort of equivalency standard that would be a little bit lower, but still a rigorous level?
I think so. I think even from the very beginning around this, I was asking for what are the core critical controls we need to validate for CMMC as well as for this. So, because even CMC, I'm leery of this 100% compliance even for CMC certification, right? Is it possible? Yes, there's a lot of effort. Is it worth? Is the return on investment there for that effort? It's up for debate, right? I'm looking for actual practical implementation. And frankly, CMMC, as far as I'm aware of, is the only framework out there that does require 100% compliance at time of assessment.
Right.
I mean, they do have question. They have certain carve-outs for it, and I applaud that and everything else, but it still leaves, is it a realistic for ongoing maintenance of security?
Sure.
It's probably my first time publicly saying that. I've said it in one-on-ones and everything else, but it is a concern. I mean, it doesn't mean you throw out the baby with the bathwater. CMC is still needed. The protection of CUI is still needed. Is there ways for us to evolve it? Yes, and even the A2LA and DoD agree to it. It's just more of how do we get there? And I'll freely admit, I haven't been involved in any sort of back-end discussions with Cyber AP or anything else like that, but I'm sure it's being worked. We just have not yet heard about it publicly.
Yeah. And I mean, that's definitely, as a C3PAO, top 3 most frequently asked question I'd say is like, first of all, can we have findings, right? No, it needs to be perfect 110 out of 110. And importantly to note, there are X number of assessment objectives per control. You need to meet each of those assessment objectives, or else you fail the control, or else you fail the assessment, right? So
that same methodology is when you go for your FedRAMP moderate equivalency, but FedRAMP moderate is 323 controls. And I haven't done the blowout of the control objectives, but I think it's in the realm of 600 to 700, if not more, disparate objectives among those 323 controls.
Wow. That's interesting to think about. I hadn't thought about the objective level of those moderate equivalency controls. Yeah,
it's the same thing. If you fail to meet one objective for control, the entire control is considered met, even in FedRAMP. So that's where the moderate equivalency gets very hard when you require that 100% compliance.
100%. Yep. All right, Tony. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I would love to cover anything else that you want. I know we've kind of tried to touch on a little bit throughout multiple different domains, FedRAMP, the DoD provisional authorization process, touching on CMMC a little bit and tying that into like FedRAMP equivalency. And if you're handling CUI as a cloud service offering, what does that mean? Is there anything that we haven't touched on yet that you thought might be good to discuss briefly here?
Nothing really comes to mind offhand that's not going to sound very sales pitchy. And I respect the podcast and this more being educational format and just answering questions in general. But I do want to make sure people understand. This does come to mind off the top of my head. People have to remember it's not FedRAMP or CMMC. Any framework or cybersecurity requirement you have to meet with the federal government does not preclude having to maintain or be compliant with other frameworks within the government regulatory requirements. So the example you said, like I'm a cloud service offering, I handle CUI, so that's the only time I won't need CMC. I'll be out of scope because I'll have a FedRAMP authorization. That's not necessarily true, because you're forgetting CUI that may be communicated outside for relation as they bid on other projects. So they get CUI for RFP requests, or they win a contract and there's FCI, so it requires CMC level 1 around their internal accounting systems, things of that nature. So just because you have FedRAMP and you say this is the main CUI we get to government doesn't mean you're not receiving other CUI or FCI that will require you to be CMC certified or self-assessed. So people have to remember, just because you have one does not preclude you from needing the other. You really have to look at your systems and the data that you are receiving in all formats and all use cases.
Really good point.
Is that necessarily easy? Not necessarily, but it can be done. It needs to be done because there's agency specific things, right? You have FedRAMP, you have CMC, you have IRS 1075 for federal tax information with Department of Treasury, you have CJIS compliance for criminal justice information for FBI and state and local law enforcement. You have HIPAA requirements when you're dealing with PHI, personal health information. You have all sorts of things. None of them preclude one from the other of maintaining compliance with those various regulatory requirements.
It's a really good point, especially with the FedRAMP and CMMC clients coming and asking, do I need both? Do I just need one? It's like, look at the scope, right? CUI or CMMC especially is very data centric about where that CUI flows, to your point of like, okay, if we're just assuming the CUI is only within my FedRAMP authorized boundary, we'll say, then sure, in that case, you're covered. But to your point, anything going forward, even if it's just federal contract information, FCI, which can just be some of these RFPs and bids and proposals, that requires CMMC, the level 1. And then even beyond that, you could be sent the CUI outside of that cloud service offering potentially. So it gets into the nuance of really, really, really understanding the data flow, where that is happening. And to your point, and this is where it can get most challenging, I think, where it will flow or may flow, right? Right. It might not be flowing there right now, but over the next 3 years of the CMMC certification, where may it be flowing in additional work that we want to or may procure, right? So you got to plan for all that.
Yep. And just the maintenance of your CUI. So remember, CUI for CMC is about where the CUI is. It's your CUI environment. That's why we don't necessarily say boundary. It is your environment, wherever that is. FedRAMP is more of a system centric where there is a specific authorization boundary. So one does not necessarily equate to the other. And that's why I very much say when any CSP tells me it's all in our FedRAMP boundary, there is no CUI anywhere else, 9 times out of 10, it's just they're forgetting about certain other aspects of their business that may just CUI. It's very rare will I ever see not your same CUI environment boundary is an exact match for your FedRAMP authorization boundary.
That's a really, really great point and anecdote, because I hear that all the time, but I am not on the implementation side, so I don't necessarily go in and see, oh, you're not thinking about X, Y, and Z. People just say, oh, and I have to take them for their word and be like, I don't know. I'm not in your system, right? But it being that that's what you guys do hands-on, it's great to hear that, well, it's not great to hear, it's scary to hear, but it's insightful to hear that a lot of times that is not actually the case when clients think that it is.
Yeah.
Tony, thank you again for joining me. I think we need to wrap up. I think this was very comprehensive, very helpful. Any last parting words of wisdom?
Don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help. No one knows everything. Especially for the OSCs, OSIs, or CSPs, your expertise is in what you provide as a service and as a product. You're not expected to know the federal stuff. That's why there's people out there like RiskPoint and me that helps with the advisory. And, obviously A-LIGN is a well-respected independent assessment authority to get this stuff done.
Yeah. Love it. All right, Tony, we'll have to do another one. Great to reconnect and relearn from you again, as always. I appreciate you, my friend.
Thank you. I appreciate you. You guys take care.